Welcome back to Calm Properties. Do you want to learn how to be more tax efficient with your earnings? If you've got a property that you live in, or if you want to get involved in investment properties, then it's really important that you learn how to be as efficient as possible with income tax, capital gains tax, and inheritance tax, all three of them. To understand how, here are two key principles that you just need to hold on to, and I'll explain why. So let's start with number one, never sell your investment property. Number two, as the property goes up in value, increase your debt against it. So let me explain. If you've got a £90,000 house and the mortgage is £67,500, which is making you, with all the expenses and the rent coming in, you end up making about £219 per calendar month. And in real simple terms, it's not exactly how it would be with your taxes, because there's lots of things that you need to take into account, but just so you get an idea, if you're a 40% taxpayer, then you would pay 40% tax on that £219. If you're a 20% taxpayer, you pay 20% on it, and if you don't pay tax anyway, then you don't pay any tax on it. It's not exactly like this, especially with all the changes, and everyone's individual cases will make it different for them, but just for simplicity and to show you the principle, that's what we're going to look at. Now, if you just think of your upbringing, and when you're being brought up, your parents and teachers and banks, it was just all around that we shouldn't have debt, and that we should be making sure that we pay off any debt that we have, and we save as much as we possibly can. Savings are a good thing. And the majority of us were raised in that way, so that's what we believed, and that message came to us. We really should be thankful for that message. It's nothing to be upset about that, oh, we shouldn't have been saving all this time if you have got savings, because it's great. It's taught us how to save, and now we can start to think about how we want to invest that money. However, the thing here is that if your parents did encourage you to do this, they were savers, not investors. And a saver believes that debt is bad. An investor understands that there's good debt and there's bad debt. So a quick definition of the two: bad debt is something you have to pay whether you've used something or not. For example, your house, or if you've gone on holiday and your house is just sat empty, then you're still paying the mortgage even though you're not using it. So that's bad debt. So for good debt, there's two main things to think of and consider to know that it is good debt. The first piece is that someone else pays for that debt. And the second is that that debt actually makes you money, which makes it good debt. So if you had that kind of debt what someone else is paying for and it's making you money, how much of that would you like? The answer is a lot. Even Richard Branson said that he wants to die having made £1 billion worth of debts. So from this information of good debt and bad debt, I'm going to take two people as an example. So the first person is Claire. And Claire says that I don't want to pay off my debt. I've heard everything you're saying, but it's just stuck inside me that I've got this house, I've got a mortgage on it, and I don't feel happy. I'm not settled until I've paid that debt off. At the same time, we've got Jake, who has listened, and he understands about the good debt, and he's decided to keep the debt on this same property. So let's assume that Claire and Jake, they've got identical jobs, identical salaries, identical house. And let's have a look at what happens in this scenario when we look at it into the future. So over the next 10 to 15 years, Claire works really hard. She wants to pay this debt off. So she earns the $65,000, the loan that she borrowed from the bank for the mortgage, and she pays that mortgage off to the point that after 10 to 15 years, she's managed to get that to zero. Whereas Jake has listened to this video and done more training and found out more, and Jake says, I'm not paying the mortgage off, and Jake chooses not to pay that mortgage off. So Claire's paid it off. What's her reward for paying all her debt off? So first of all, the £253 that she was paying is now not being paid. So that comes into her profits and it's added to that 219. So Claire is now mortgage free. But the government looks at this and the government says, although you two, you've got the same job, you've got the same salary, you've got the same house, but Claire, you've paid off your debt. So now, Claire, I'm going to tax you £100 a month. Congratulations for paying off your mortgage. So that ends up being £1,200 a year just because Claire chose to pay off her mortgage. So the first rule is to not pay it down. So we have to have an interest-only mortgage, not a repayment mortgage, because a repayment mortgage is actually paying the mortgage down. So while Claire was busy paying off all her mortgage, what's Jake's situation? So Jake, he's still got that money, the $68,500. So with that money, he's been able to party, holiday, live life to the full if he wanted to, or he could have also been really wise and decided to put that money into more investment properties. So Jake would have 4 investment properties going up in value, while Claire only had that one. Another reason not to pay it down, because it slows down your future growth. So with Jake's situation, there's still a little problem because Jake didn't pay his mortgage off and the rent is going to be going up every year. So after about 3 years, the rental would be maybe about $710. So the problem here is that because his rentals increased, his incomings have increased to £60 a month now, he's got £60 extra. So those profits would now be taxed. So he would therefore be paying more tax. But we can solve this as well, because over those 3 years, there would have been some inflation and maintenance costs would have gone up, and also the value of the property would have gone up. So what Jake does is he goes back to the bank and he asks if he can borrow 75% of the new value of his property. The bank obviously says, of course, you've put the rents up so you can afford and you can manage that extra amount, and Jake's happy to take that on because his rent will pay for it anyway. So if we assume that the mortgage goes up to $300 a month, just for easy numbers, Jake is now, although he's getting extra, he's also paying extra in that mortgage. So it means that he won't have to pay any more extra tax, and he's also had that £68,000 that he's been able to invest. So that's going back to the second principle I mentioned at the start. As your property goes up, increase your debt against it, and then you stay income tax efficient. Okay, so the next piece, we buy a house for 100,000 and on average they double every 8 years in the UK, but let's just be safe and say every 15 years that house will double. So 15 years from now it's worth 200k. 15 years after that, it will be worth 400k. So let's assume we then sell the house. Going back to Claire and Jake, Claire sells her house and the government comes along and says, right, you've got capital gains tax to pay here. You're 40% taxpayer, so it's 28% of that that's tax. So that's £84,000. That's your tax bill. So if you're a 20% taxpayer, that tax bill will be £54,000. That's a huge amount that needs to be paid if that house was to be sold. So Claire sells it for 400k and she pays the tax bill, she pays the estate agent, solicitors, and she's left with about 300,000 in her bank. Now Jake, he says, hang on, I know not to sell, so I'm not going to sell, I'm going to refinance. So if Jake borrows the 75% of that 400k, then that's £300,000. So Jake has 300,000 in the bank, just the same as what Claire had. So the difference is that Jake still owns the house. Claire's lost her house. So they both get their 300,000, but Jake still owns his house. So Jake holds onto it for another 15 years and it doubles again. The only caveat to this is that if you bought a really poor, rubbish investment property in the first place, and that's why we do so much work on teaching people how to find the right property in the right area, making sure the numbers really do work. And we've done a video on this before as well, which we'll put a link on here for if you want to watch that, so you know, because that's so crucial. So now let's look at inheritance tax. When you pass away, the first $325,000 that you pass on is tax-free. So for simplicity, we can just assume that the residential house, the car, all your assets that you've got personally, that will eat up into that $325K. So let's go back to the earlier scenario where Claire had paid off her mortgages and she'd spent the last 20 or so years of her life mortgage free, but she's being taxed £100 a month, we said. But what else happens now? She has £1 million worth of portfolio. So when she passes away, she's got no debt on that. So the government will come along and say to Claire's kids, you've got 40% tax bill on this, and you need to pay that $400K in the next 12 months. So Claire wouldn't have predicted when she was going to die. So let's say she died in a flat or failing market. Her kids have then got a year to sell the houses so that they can pay that $400,000 to the government. So no doubt, because they're trying to do this quickly, they will be selling them below market value. So Claire has worked her whole life to make this portfolio for her children, and now her children are in a situation that they're having to sell up quickly to try and rapidly give money to the government. So they sell the portfolio up. It was worth $1 million. They've sold it for $800,000 because they're working on a timeline. They're trying to sell it quickly. They pay the bill of $400,000. The children will now end up with £400,000. So that was £1 million portfolio that Claire had left for her children and worked so hard to get that portfolio, get it to £1 million. But she only managed to leave her children £400,000. So now let's go back to Jake. And Jake didn't pay the mortgages down. He has £1 million portfolio as well, but he's got debts on it. So remember, this is good debt. Someone else is paying for it and it's making him money, £1,800 a month, so $25K a year. So he's happy. When he passes away, the 40% tax is charged on the equity. So it's 40% of a $250,000 bill, which is only £100,000, not £400,000 like Claire's kids had to pay. I know which bill I'd rather leave for my kids. So if you look at that, it's absolutely phenomenal, Jake's situation. And you can reduce the 10K with more learning, which I can teach you more about that if we do some work together. But that 100K can go down to 10K compared to the 400K that Claire's children are paying. And it's the same situation. It's just they've chosen to look at tax and look at wealth and look at money differently. So if you want to learn how to apply this to your own situation, contact us through the links in our bio or on our website, calmproperties.com. Remember to like, subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss an upload, and leave any questions below.